Today, I'd like to dedicate this episode to Lisa Meyer. She was married to Steve Meyer for 32 years, and she passed away suddenly on January 26th of 2025. And we would like to dedicate this episode to her today. Hope you rest in peace, Lisa.
Welcome to Hidden History of Rock and Roll with your host, Tiffany Scott. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Hidden History of Rock and Roll.
Hello and welcome to Hidden History of Rock and Roll. I'm your host, Tiffany Scott, and if you are new to my podcast, I do a deep dive into the behind-the-scenes stories of rock's greatest legends, how they came to be, how the records got played, and maybe some dirty secrets if we are lucky. This is your all-access backstage pass. Today, I am welcoming back to the show an industry legend, Steve Meyer. If you didn't catch his first episode, Steve has worked with some really amazing rock legends like Bob Seger, John Lennon, the Beatles, Elton John, Boston, Olivia Newton John, Steve Miller, Pink Floyd, the Fixx, Night Ranger, Bobby Brown, and he promoted Tom Petty while at MCA Records. All right, so today we're going to get right into it. In this episode, Steve is going to be sharing with us his insight into the time working with the Fabulous Four, the Beatles.
I really think it's important that in the history of popular music, that the Beatles, I think the public knows a lot about the Beatles from documentaries, from films, from movies, et cetera, et cetera. But there's things that are often neglected in talking about their legacy that people don't know about. Beatlephiles might know, but the public in general doesn't know, and their influence on popular culture was awesome. It literally changed everything. And when they appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in February 9th of 64, 74 million people in the United States tuned in. I don't know what percentage of households that was, but you can imagine how huge that is, because that kind of audience today is only garnered by something like the Super Bowl. 8 months later, they had 28 records on Billboard's Hot 100 singles chart and 11 in the top 100. And out of those 11 singles they had on the top 100, 5 of them were the first 5 singles, in April of 64.
Wow.
They had Can't Buy Me Love, Twist and Shout, She Loves You, I Want to Hold Your Hand, and Please Please Me. And then they had, of course, the others that were down below the top 5. No one's ever accomplished that feat. And I don't know if anybody ever will, based on the way streaming is doing recording of plays now. I guess if anybody could do it, maybe Taylor Swift might. Mm-hmm. She seems to be the biggest thing in the moment. Mm-hmm. But just how much they changed everything, as you know, has been the subject of books, articles, TV, and of course now they teach them in college even. Mm-hmm. Some of the things that I think that they really uprooted the popular culture that people are unaware of is that in 1965, when the Beatles released Rubber's Soul, they did something that the record company, Capitol Records, was not thrilled about. And that was they delivered an album and they said, you can't release a single. Mm. And needless to say, there was tremendous concern within the building and the company, because a single back then on Top 40 radio was your vehicle to sell records. However, the Beatles said, no, we're not going to allow it. We think this is a piece by itself, and it's more serious than what we've been doing, and we don't want a single. Let people discover it. Well, the album came out and shot right to number one in retail. And when that happened, radio decided that we better do something. We can't avoid not playing something from the number one album in the United States. So they ended up playing Michelle, basically, or I'm Looking Through You, or You Won't See Me. And the album ended up selling scores of, millions like all their other albums. It didn't make any difference. And in fact, the Beatles followed their own plan with subsequent albums. There was no single released on Sgt. Pepper. There was no single on the Double Pocket White album. But they were the first to ever achieve album airplay at top 40 radio. Nobody before them, including Elvis, who was at that time king of the world, had ever achieved that kind of status. Wow. So it really shook. It changed radio dramatically, and people started looking at it differently. They decided in some cities that maybe there's an audience that wants to just hear songs from albums and not hit singles, and that gave birth to the format of album radio, which, as you well know, your dad thrived in, and stations were created in Boston and New York and San Francisco and Chicago and elsewhere as it spread. And these programmers said, we can start playing cuts from albums. But the Beatles were the first to really do that. And the fact is that also on Rubber Soul, the Beatles also did something musically revolutionary. They introduced the Western music world and popular culture to the sitar on Norwegian wood. That was the first time a sitar had ever been played in pop music. Yeah. And I don't think people back then were even aware of what it was. They knew it was a different instrument. Of course, George continued with that and played it on other albums as well. But that was the first, the Rolling Stones followed suit when they had sitar on Painted Black. And speaking of the Rolling Stones, while we mention them, it should also be known to most people that the Beatles wrote the Rolling Stones' first hit record in England. And that record was I Want to Be Your Man, which they did put on their first Beatle album with Ringo singing. Wow. But they actually gave that to the Rolling Stones for their first chart single. That was the Rolling Stones' first entree.
What a gift.
To rate. Yeah. So, another thing that's happening right now around the world is that basically every other day we get updates on where Taylor Swift is and the stadiums that she's playing. I don't think people are aware that prior to the Beatles, there was no such thing as stadium rock. It didn't exist. Elvis had never played a stadium. In fact, he never played a stadium until 1977. Right. But the Beatles played Shea Stadium in 64. That's 60,000 tickets. When they booked Shea Stadium, a lot of the critics and a lot of the people in the media world said, they laughed at it, and they thought it was not going to happen. It was going to be a flop. They sold it out very quickly.
I'm sure.
And that was the first time any popular band, rock band, had ever played a stadium. They subsequently played stadiums all over the United States. They, Candlestick Park, everywhere. They were the first group that did that, and they created it. They frankly gave up touring because at some point back then the technology was so far behind where it is today. So when you played a stadium, I was at Shea Stadium in '64. You couldn't hear them. You heard you felt the drone of the music, and you could feel the bass, but you couldn't really hear them because of the screams. Today, of course, when somebody plays a stadium, you can hear everything because of the technology. But go ahead.
I was just going to say, let's talk about how, your involvement with the Beatles and why we are discussing them today.
Well, my involvement, first of all, I was always a Beatles fan, obviously. And 5 years after seeing them on Ed Sullivan, I ended up lucky enough to be working for Capitol Records. And it was a dream come true. I worked for Capitol in various promotion capacities from 1969 until 1976. And then I got promoted to national promotion into the Capitol Tower in Hollywood. And when I got there, I expressed my profound love for the Beatles, and I was a fan. And there was a committee inside Capitol. It was the unofficial Beatles committee. And it was a group of people that oversaw what we were going to do with their catalog from that point forward in terms of repackages, et cetera. And I had been very disappointed in the package they put together for rock and roll, which was the first repackage they did after the Beatles broke up. But it had like a silver Mylar cover, and I didn't like it. I just thought it was not up to par for what the Beatles standards were. And I expressed that very vocally. And the next time we got to thinking about a repackage, they were thinking about Beatle ballads. And I said, why don't we do Beatle love songs? And instead. And we sat in a meeting and we discussed it. And they all said, why don't you go home for the weekend and come up with some ideas? And, how can we package it? What songs, et cetera. And I went home, and the first thing I was very concerned with was the package itself, because I hated the rock and roll album. And I went through my box of vinyl and found an album cover that I just always loved, and that was the Crosby, Stills and Nash Deja Vu album. And it looked like brown leather with gold imprint and sepia tone photograph. And it just looked classic. And I said, it should be something like this. I mocked up a cover with a Richard Avedon photograph of the Beatles. I spent the weekends picking songs. It was a double pocket album, by the way. And, we put that together. I brought it back to work, and it ended up being the package. And actually, we were going to release a single prior to the album release, and we were going to put out the song "Girl," which also was from the Rubber Soul album, but was going to be on the Love Song album. And I can't answer this question, but about a week prior to the release of the album, EMI, our parent company, killed the single. They said, do not release a single. Now, I don't know if that had to do with contractual obligations between the UK and the United States, or whether it had to do with relationships with the Beatles between the two companies. I really don't know. But if you look on YouTube, you'll see promo sleeves for that record. And radio was ready to embrace it and play it because it had never been a single. So, yeah, and I'm really sad. The album was a huge success. It was a double pocket album, and it ended up going platinum anyway. And to this day, I still get emails, texts, and questions from people saying, where can I find it? Where can I get it? And you can't get it because when they went to the universal catalog of all the albums being the same, both UK and US, they did away with all the repackages. Wow. So, it's not, you can't get any of the repackages anymore.
Maybe we have some photos we can put up on the website for people to see.
Yeah. And people, but it's amazing because I literally a couple of times a month will get a text or an email saying, where can I find it? Is it out of print? And I go on eBay, go on Amazon, see if you find the used one. But people love that collection and they still enjoy it. So that for me was a tremendous, I love being part of that package. And it was also, for me to have the opportunity to work with any of them, or talk with any of them was always, to me, I considered it a gift because, I was there in that seat and everybody at the label who was working with them had that opportunity. But I always asked musical questions or a question specific. I was so curious, I didn't hold back.
Yeah.
So, and like I had asked, when I had spoken to John Lennon in New York back in 71, and I had asked him, during the course of the evening, about the Magical Mystery Tour record and album. And, he came right out and said the whole thing was Paul's idea. And he wanted to do something. Brian Epstein had died. He wanted to create something new to carry on. And, that's another great story because the Magical Mystery Tour was made in 1967, 13 years prior to the release of what became MTV and Music Video World. And if you really, when Magical Mystery Tour was put together by the Beatles, it was put together for a TV special in England. And the critics panned it. All of them panned it. It was never released on TV in the United States. It was released in some small theaters. In hindsight, when one watches that now, you see how forward-thinking the Beatles were in making music videos, because you've got inside of that film the video for I Am the Walrus, which has been all over the world and everybody's seen it. The video for Magical Mystery Tour, Blue Jay Way, Fool on the Hill. So they were very forward-thinking when it came to videos. In fact, if you look at some of the early videos that are available on YouTube and elsewhere, like, for example, if you look at Rain or Paperback Writer, they're playing their instruments, but they're not plugged into any equipment.
Oh, no.
They're just going through they're lip syncing and going through the motions. And they really got tired of that. So that's why they really came up with conceptualizing their videos. Wow. And they really went forward with that. And they were light years ahead in terms of doing that than other groups at that time. And you had to have, back then, and of course in England, you had to have a video if you wanted to have a big hit, because there was a show on BBC called Top of the Pops. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't get a video for Top of the Pops, you were pretty locked out of having a hit record. Now, the Beatles, of course, would have sold regardless, but they did it so they had that exposure as well. And they wanted that for their audience because they weren't touring. They gave up touring when they realized that nobody could hear them live. Wow. So they were very, very, very forward thinking. And in the studio, what they did was extraordinary. If one looks at Sgt. Pepper today, and everybody calls it a masterpiece. It's a recording masterpiece. Mm-hmm. It's an engineering masterpiece. And it's hard to really think about this going back to that year, 1967, the Summer of Love, but that was recorded in 4-track. And that meant that the Beatles and George Martin and whoever else was in the studio with them, they had to play 4, mixed another 4 down to another 4, record another 4 and mix those down to another 4. And when you listen to that album today, it sounds as well produced and engineered as anything that was ever recorded in 32, 64 track or beyond. It's an incredible feat. And they learned that by being innovative in the studio and having to do what they did in the studio. And again, that opened the door for other groups to come along, mm-hmm. Pink Floyd, for example, mm-hmm. and experiment in the studio, right. and do what they had to do. So they did so much for changing, anything that the Beatles did at that time, somebody followed suit with, whether it was their hair, their clothes, the music. It was like a ripple, like throwing the rock into the water and watch the ripple effect. Mm-hmm. Everything that they did, it affected everything. Mm-hmm. When they decided they weren't going to put a single on Rubber Soul, then, the Rolling Stones decided on an album they weren't going to do it. And then another group came in and said, we don't need a single. They changed the way the popular music culture operated and was operating at that time. They completely turned it upside down. And thank God, because of their talent, they were able to do that, and they were able to move on. Another thing that people always mistake is that most people believe that don't know the history of the recording of the Beatles, that the Let It Be or Get Back album, whichever you want to call it, that was the last Beatle album. And that is true when it comes to saying it's the last Beatle album released. But it was actually recorded before Abbey Road, and it was put on a shelf. And it was not, that album was not finished, actually. It was put on the shelf. And again, Paul really rallied the troops back to the studio. And Abbey Road is the last Beatle album where they all participated together on a project. Because when the Let It Be album came out commercially, it had been reproduced by Phil Spector at that time.
Wow.
Much to the dismay of Paul wasn't happy about that at all. The Beatles had broken up, and the other three overrode the decision, but Phil Spector reproduced that album. That's why there are several versions of that album that came out. There was the Naked Let It Be album, where they stripped it down and put on the original way it was recorded. But that was not the last Beatle album as a group. The last Beatle album as a group was Abbey Road. And it's ironic that, that album closes with the couplet, in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. That's the last two lines they ever wrote. And I don't think anybody in the general public has, any memory, they wouldn't of the oldies and the songs that the Beatles gave to other people. That they gave Peter and Gordon A World Without Love. They gave Billy J. Kramer Bad to Me. They signed a guy named James Taylor to Apple Records before he ever had a hit called Fire and Rain. They allowed, the first time ever in history that a guest artist was allowed to play on a Beatle record was on the White Album, when George was going to the studio in a cab with Eric Clapton, and he said, "I want you to play on this track." And Eric said, "Well, I'm not, I'm doing my own thing." And George said, "Come in." And he walked in the studio with Eric, and that's Eric Clapton's lead guitar, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps.
Oh, wow.
That was the first time anybody had ever played, other than the Beatles, on a Beatle album. And that opened the doors, obviously, for the future when Billy Preston was involved with their stuff. So, I could go on and talk for hours about what they did and how they've done it. There's two books that I think anybody in your audience who wants to know more about the Beatles, I might have mentioned this before. I don't really know, but they're the two books that, independent of each other, are just terrific source information. One is called A Hard Day's Right, W-R-I-T-E. And I think that's by Steve Turner. That tells the story about the creation of every Beatles song, what it's about or what it's not about, what you might think it's about. But he tells the story about where they got the idea from. It's an incredible book. And the other book, which is the Bible to me, and it should be for anyone who is a true Blue Beatle fan, it's called The Complete Beatles Recording. And it's by Mark Lewison. And you can find it on Amazon. And that book, with a foreword by Paul McCartney, by the way, is a complete log of every date that the Beatles went into the studio and recorded anything, even if it wasn't a finished piece. In other words, if there's a date that Paul McCartney came in and just wanted to throw the bass in on this or try something new, it's logged in this book. If there's a day where they wanted to, take a song off and put another one on, it's in the book. And it's very, very, technical. So you can see every creation for every song, for every album, dated, timed, and everything. And it's a Bible. It really is. So that's why when you see all the stuff online, all the rumors about songs and this happened in this, you can go right back to that book and look in the date and the song and go right there and say, it's not true. Wow. This is what really happened.
This is what really happened. Wow.
So, yeah, and it's an incredible book. He spent years. He's a world-renowned Beatle expert, and that book is, like I said, it's a Bible.
Yeah, we'll have to put all that information on the website.
Yeah, it's an incredible book. I've turned I don't know how many people onto it, and they always call me up and they go, thank you, because it answers a million questions. About the way they recorded, how they recorded, what they recorded, who did what, who played what, there's a million surprises in there. So you learn about the overdubbing and who might have played this and who might have played that. That's fascinating information for real Beatle fans. Until I got that book, or right about the time I did get it, I didn't know, for example, even though I worked at Capitol, I didn't know that on the song, The Ballad of John and Yoko, that's just John and Paul. There's no other, they're the only two Beatles on that record. Paul's playing the bass, Paul's playing the drums, and he's playing the rhythm guitar, and John's playing the little lead thing. And I didn't even know that. Funny. So those little factoids are all throughout that. All throughout that book.
Oh, that is too cool. I'm going to take a break real quick for a Patreon ad.
If you are enjoying listening to Hidden History of Rock and Roll, please consider becoming a friend of the show on Patreon for only $5 a month. Your support will help deliver more excellent content. Plus, as a member, get your questions answered by the next legendary guest. Thanks for being the best part of Hidden History of Rock and Roll.
Thanks so much. We're back with Steve Meyer, and he is talking all things Beatles.
Yes, and aren't they a subject? They're a subject, as I said. They're talking about them in schools now, and they're teaching courses on them. And it's amazing how many people send me questions because they heard this or they were taught this in the school. And they say, is this true about, this record, or is this true about this song and this and that? And I go, how did you get my name and how did you find me? And they did a search, and I've been online for so many years. I used to do a newsletter that went to about 5,000 industry people, and it was always heavily focused on Beatle music and as well as news. So they send me these questions, and there's stuff that they might learn about musical stuff specific to the Beatles' music and growth in terms of what they did for popular music, because they unlike so many other groups, they changed the way songs were created. And instead of songs being 4, 8, or 12 chords, the Beatles experimented with all these new chords and new music. So when I get these questions and I answer them, I start a dialogue with some of these people, and I refer them to the books, and they just stay in contact. And I've had people in contact with me now 5, 10, or 20 years that will drop a note and ask me about a specific record. Why did this happen, or why did that, or when they went to the Universal Catalog, why did all the albums change? Because the English albums, when Rubber Soul came out here, and on all the other Beatles albums here, the Meet the Beatles and all of them, we had 10 cuts on our American albums, but the UK albums had 12 or 14. And that had to do with publishing and royalties. And that was, by the way, not only for the Beatles, it was for all groups from the UK. Their catalog was different unless it was one piece album like Dark Side of the Moon. So when they went to the Universal catalog, people would text me and write me and say, how come Rubber Soul is different now? There's these 4 other tracks. How come Beatles for Sale, which ended up Beatles 65 in the United States, how come that has different tracks? And those were the reasons for that. The Beatles also didn't like to release. They didn't like to sell. As I mentioned already, they didn't want a single on Rubber Soul. A lot of times when they put out a single, it was between working on album projects, and they put out the singles because of contractual obligations to EMI, and also because they were writing these songs. They were just a factory. So when they put out 8 days a week or a number of songs like that, We Can Work It Out, they weren't attached to a specific album. So in America, we repackaged Capitol Records. The first repackage that came out with pickup hits was called Yesterday and Today, which originally became the Butcher Block cover, the famed Butcher Block cover. And the story behind the Butcher Block cover was that you can see on YouTube, or if you just Google it, the original cover was the Beatles in white butcher jackets with meat all around them and blood. And it was a pretty hard, and the reason that was the cover was because the Beatles looked at selling music twice as butchering their music. And that was their statement. Well, it went out initially to retail, and the response was overwhelmingly negative. Retailers hated it. Parents didn't like it. So they repackaged it. That's why those covers.
Well, I'm looking at it now. I'm looking at it now online, and it's got babies all over. And some of them are bloody.
If you have one of those original, covers, they're worth a lot of money now. They repackaged it with a generic photograph of the Beatles sitting on a trunk and a very boring picture. And that was the first repackage. But they just didn't like selling back stuff twice. In fact, the only other time that happened was after they broke up. In 69, in 69 and 70, Alan Klein, who represented 3 of the Beatles, told us at a Capitol convention there was going to be a new Beatles album. And there was a, quote, new, unquote, album released, but it was all old songs. It was the Hey Jude album. Because Hey Jude was not on the White Album. Even though Revolution was, Hey Jude was not on the White Album. And that all fell under, again, the Beatles not wanting to sell back twice to the public, et cetera, et cetera. But that had a bunch of pickup songs as well that had not been related to specific albums. And again, you can't find that album anymore because it is a repackage.
Yeah, I'm looking at it on, it looks like Etsy, actually. It's, there's 6 songs, and it's going for $1,200. The Beatles, Yesterday and Today. It's a third.
The Butcher Block or Hey Jude?
It's a third state butcher cover, but it's it's going.
Yeah, I mean, they if you've got one of those in mono, it's more money. If you've got one that's unopened, it's worth even more money. And what's really sad is when I started work in promotion in Florida in 72, I found about 12 of those in the drawer of the desk that had belonged to the previous promotion man.
Wow.
And I ended up giving them as gifts to radio program directors back then who were true Beatle fans. I never imagined in my wildest dreams that they'd end up being worth all that money, because there were a lot sold initially. A couple 100,000 before they pulled it back. But I wish I had kept one.
Yeah, this one says recorded in England, and it is a third state mono Scranton butcher cover, and it's going for $2,000.
Yeah,
that would have been a keeper.
Yep. And they are. Yeah, I mean, they're. My only regret about working at Capitol all those years is I had all the promo stuff from the Beatles, and there was so much of it that I never really thought that it would ever be worth much because there was such quantities of it. The stand-ups for the stores, the displays, the this and that. But I really regret that. And the one thing that I really that happened to not just me, but it happened to the Capitol, is I came to work one day, and on my wall, all my gold records were gone, and my bosses were all gone, and we had been robbed overnight.
Oh my God!
And the gold records, thank God, I could replace. But the one thing I couldn't replace was that my previous boss, Al Corey, gave me a gift because he knew what a rabid Beatle fan I was. He gave me a gift with a photo of the Beatles, and he got them all to sign the photograph.
Oh my God!
And I had it wrapped in plastic and framed, and it was stolen. And I never got it back. The police solved the crime in about 5 minutes because they figured out who could get in and out of the building with all the gold records. And the only people that could get in and out of the building after hours were the janitors. And they figured it out. They took them out. They took them out and they sold them at some collector's thing. Years later, I found out from a friend of mine who went over to UK, and he's in the UK and he's eating lunch at the Hard Rock Cafe, and he brings back the placemat from the Hard Rock, and he says, "Hey, you're famous, look." And he circled, and on the Hard Rock thing, they had all the icons on the walls named, and two of the things that were on there were gold records. One was for Band on the Run, and one was for the Ringo album, and those are two of the records that were stolen from my office that somebody had sold, and the Hard Rock had bought them, I guess.
That should not be allowed. That is just
no. So anyway, I replaced my my key Beatle albums, the Love Songs, the Imagine album, and I sent them. I've long since given them to my son as keepsakes. Those will be valuable someday, and also great mementos. Getting to work with them or being a part of the team that helped work with them, I always considered it, like I said, a gift. It was never work. It was just like having the opportunity to talk. John made it easy because John said, "I'm just John." I met him after the Beatles broke up, and he just, "I'm John." That was the Beatles, and he made it real easy. But they were all easy to work with. John was the most accessible because he was in the United States mostly 90% of the time. Paul was back and forth between the UK, and he had bought which I think he still has. He bought a ranch in Tucson, and I believe he still has it. And it's where Linda spent her last days with Paul. And of course, Ringo is now full time in Los Angeles. And George was there before he passed.
Oh. And anyone who didn't catch your first episode, you did tell a really great story about meeting John Lennon.
Yeah. Well, we had a trade liaison in New York. At that time, the trade magazines were all headquartered in New York City. There were three of them: Billboard, Cashbox, and Record World. There's only one now, Billboard. But they were headquartered in New York back then, with satellite offices in L.A., soon it reversed. But we had a trade liaison, and he was in the hospital at the time. And they asked me to cover the trades. And that meant going there every week and giving them your sales updates and any pertinent information that might be upcoming. Like, we just put this album out, look for it. It might come on the charts. So we were responsible for that. And John had come to the office previously to introduce himself to some of the staff. And when I met him, I happened to have the same glasses he had, those round glasses. I had the walrus mustache.
Oh, wow.
And the first thing he said was, "I like your glasses." And I said, "Thank you." And then I said, "I'd like to take you to WNEW at some point." And he said, "Well, we'll do that. You know, don't worry about it. We'll get to that." And then he left. And sometime later, the Imagine album went to 1. And to myself, I said, I'm going to try to call and tell him. I'm sure he already knows, because Alan Klein was based in New York. John was being managed by Alan Klein at that point, and I'm sure he knows. But I'm going to call him anyway because I'd really like to get him to go to radio. So I picked up the phone and tried to call, and I went through, I don't know how many people. Who are you? Who are you? What do you do? And I was nobody back then. I was just Steve Meyer, album marketing for the East Coast, you know, promotion. But he finally picked up after I went through, and I said, I just want to give him his chart numbers and tell him about NEW. And he finally picked up, and I told him, and he didn't know. He hadn't heard yet. So I said, he said, is it real? When can I see it? And I said, well, it's not coming out till next week, but the chart numbers are given us till a week in advance, and the album's number 1. And he said, my God, come on over here and have a drink with us. So I had worked for, I think I might have mentioned this in the first podcast, but I had worked for 8 different heads of promotion in 18 months at Capitol Records. And it wasn't a good time for the label. And I didn't really think I was going to be there that much longer. So I said to myself, let me think about this. Go over and have a drink with the Beatles, or possibly not. So I went over there, and I walked into the room, and you know, it was filled with suits, and I immediately felt out of place, because here I was in jeans and long hair and the mustache. I looked like an artist, not a record guy, and I felt out of place. And I put my drink down. There was an open bar in the room. I put my drink down and walked over to John, who was talking to some of these guys. And I put my hand out and I said, hey, John, I can see you're real busy. I just want to congratulate you again. You know, I'm thrilled. We're all so happy. And we have to catch up and go to NEW. And he said, where are you going? And I said, you know, I can see you're really busy. You know, you got your thing. No, don't go anywhere. And I said, it's okay. It's okay. You know, and I really wanted to get out of there. I felt very uncomfortable. But he said, no, just hold on a minute. So I waited. And a few minutes later, he waved me, and we went into this little room that was adjoining the main room. And he said, these aren't my friends. These are people that work for me. And they're trying to help Yoko and I, and this and that. And I said, I understand. It's okay. Let's just get a schedule together for going to radio. He said, no, let's just talk. He said, I'm so happy you called. He said, right after you called, he did get the phone call from Alan Klein. But he said he had heard from me anyway. And he sat down and he said, you know, this means so much to us, and it's been a long, hard fight, and this and that. And in the middle of it, he goes, so what kind of music do you like? And like an idiot, I said the Beatles. and then he said, no, forget that. What do you like other than that? And then I said the magic words. I said, well, I really like Bob Dylan. And he loved Bob Dylan. And so he did 20 minutes on Bob Dylan. Oh, yeah. And we ended up talking about music. And we started talking, and then it was like talking to a friend of mine. Like, it wasn't like talking to a Beatle. It was like talking to a friend.
Wow, that's cool.
And the next thing I know, I look down at my watch and I go, oh my God, we've been in conversation almost 4 hours.
Oh my God.
And it was like 3.5, 4 hours. And I went, oh my God. I said, I'm so sorry. It's so late. I said, I'm sorry, you must have stuff to, and he said, no, it's okay. But I said, well, I gotta go. I gotta get up in 4 hours and go to work, So I left and, walking literally on air to the 20 or 30 blocks to the apartment that I was staying at. And it was I almost got fired for this because the next day when I went to work, at 9:00, my secretary was in tears and she said, you have to call the president of Capitol Records at home. And I said, what? Now, 9:00 in New York, it means it's 6 a.m. in LA. So I said, the president, how would he even know who I am? Because, my position was created just a few months ago and the guy who hired me has been fired. So he probably doesn't even know who I am. She goes, well, he's called like 3 times and he wants you to call him the minute you come in. So I called him and I got my head handed to me because he said, the conversation started with, who gave you the permission to call a Beatle? And I said, in regards to what? And he said, you called John Lennon yesterday and gave him his chart number. And I said, yeah, I'm handling the trades because Joe Maimone's in the hospital and this and that. And he said, only the president of Capitol Records communicates with the Beatles or their management. That is the rule. And who in God's name gave you that? I said, nobody. They just told me to cover the trades. I had to call John anyway about going to radio. So I just, in the course of the conversation, told him the album was one. Well, we're going to get to the bottom. You better never, ever let that happen. And I really hung up the phone, came outside and remember saying to my secretary, I probably won't be working here much longer. But nothing, it blew over. And actually, that president ended up getting fired very shortly after that as well, which I wasn't unhappy about at all.
Yeah, no kidding. John.
And but John, what was amazing was when I went to Florida to go back to do Florida promotion. One of the albums that subsequent solo albums that John put out was Walls and Bridges, and I got a request from a station in Orlando, one of my album stations, and they begged me. They begged me to get a interview with John. So I said, well, I'll call and see what I can do. So I called the tower and told my boss, Al Corey, and Al said, here, call this number in New York and see if you can get him. And I called and I left a long message and I said, this message is for John. My name is Steve Meyer. We met in New York. And bang out, like an hour later, he called me back.
Wow.
And he said, what are you doing in Florida? And I said, I'm working here now. He said, give me he said, call back and give the information to my assistant and I'll be glad to do the radio interview.
That's really cool.
He was an extraordinary man. I don't know if I mentioned in the first podcast about, what Elton John said about him. But years later, when I'm working at MCA, we were flying Elton John around on a media tour. And there was a book, I think it was called The 9 Lives of Lennon. It was a very negative book about John and his drug use and just a very negative book. And Elton, I don't know if people know this, but Elton John is Sean Lennon's godfather. And Elton and John were like brothers. Wow. And we're on the plane going to one of the cities and Elton's reading the paper about it. And he goes, I hate this book. And I said, yeah, I haven't read that book, but I said, all these stories I've heard, that's not the John that I knew. And he said, what do you mean that you knew? And I said, I worked the Capitol 14 years. I met him. I worked with him, and he goes, really? He said, what did you think of him? And I said, well, I there was an extraordinary aura about him that when he walked into the room, I can't explain it. And Elton cut me off and he said, he was a bloody saint. Yeah. And I said, for lack of something else that I could think of, yeah, okay, that's it. And he was extraordinary.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, his music said so much about who he was. His music.
All of them collectively. Just the coming together of four amazing, talented people. People always say to me, don't you think the Rolling Stones were a better band? And I go, yeah, they're a better band because they perform live. But in terms of music coming together from four distinct, separately individual talented people, the Beatles were extraordinary musicians, songwriters, singers, innovators in the studio.
Yeah. And the fan base is just huge.
Yeah, I don't think. Look, their music. It's 60 years from the date that they came here, and we still hear them and listen to them. And their catalog still sells. Yeah. I don't think that's an accident, and I don't think it's for any other reason other than it's the quality of the music. And the music has withstood the greatest test of all, the test of time. Yeah. And I don't want to take anything away from Taylor Swift. She's an extraordinary talent. She's got extraordinary songs and everything. I just don't know whether in 60 years people will be pulling out Taylor Swift albums the way they're pulling out Beatles albums.
And time will tell.
I don't think they'll. Yeah, and I don't think they'll be studying her music the way they study the Beatles now. I have one of my best friends is my music theory teacher from college at the University of Miami. We're still friends 50 plus years later. And we have this dialogue all the time about popular music and where it's going. And I asked him the question just recently. I said, is it possible that in the world of popular music that we've seen the best of whatever is going to be created? Because will there ever be another Sgt. Pepper, another Dark Side of the Moon, another album by like Elton John? And he said, it's getting to the point where you can almost say no,
right?
Because nobody's ever been able, and it's got nothing to do with the format of radio anymore, because the exposure for the artist is there online. So if somebody was to create something extraordinary, it would pop off online like they always do anyway. Right. But, what the Beatles created, and of course it's not, I'm not talking about all of their entire work. I mean, Love Me Do isn't the same as listening to Sgt. Pepper or the White Album. It's a great pop song, and you can still enjoy listening to it. But when they got serious, when they did Rubber Soul, it changed everything.
Right.
It turned the heat up on everybody.
Right. And they have evolved with every album. They evolved.
They grew up.
Yeah, and
they grew. They had it inside them, and it came out in floods.
And I know I have a lot of fans that listen to Hidden History of Rock and Roll that are huge Beatle fans, and they're really looking forward to this episode coming out. But I do have a few fan questions if you want to go ahead and see if we can answer those.
Sure, go. No, I love answering the questions.
So my first question comes from a friend and also a Patreon member, Rob Christie. He's in Manhattan Beach, California, and he wants to know, how did the Beatles get played on the radio back in the day?
Well, of course, when they first started, it was dramatically different from once they were established. But allegedly, and you can go online and check this, the man that was credited with first playing the Beatles was a DJ named James Carroll, and he worked at WWDC in Washington, D.C. And he's credited as being the first DJ to play a Beatles record on the radio. I guess if it's online, you can take some credence in it. I have a difficult time with that, because what happened was prior to their actually getting radio airplay, there was a Friday night show on NBC back then called I think it was called Friday Night with Jack Parr. Jack Parr was originally the host of the Tonight Show. He preceded Johnny Carson. And his wife and his daughter had come back from a trip to UK, and they had witnessed Beatlemania firsthand. And they took an 8mm camera with them to go see the Beatles. And you can find this on YouTube. You can find a clip of Jack Parr doing this. And he's talking about this, and he goes, he didn't understand it, but he said, I have a feeling these guys are going to be really big. Mm-hmm. And that preceded any radio play. So I don't know, following that, a little station somewhere might have done something, but this guy is originally given the credit for it. And it's been reported several places online. I guess that's because of radio station logs, that they had to all do because of publishing. So how did they get airplay? He, on his show, obviously had the levity to play music that was not necessarily already in the library, approved by the musical program director. Mm-hmm. So he gave it exposure, which a lot of DJs did, as they started reading the newspapers after they went to the number one in the UK repeatedly. There were a couple of DJs elsewhere in the United States that started sampling their music. And they were originally, here's something that probably people can't even believe, but originally when EMI sent the Beatles records over to Capitol in the US, Capitol Records turned them down.
What?
Turned them down a couple of times.
Wow. 2
or 3 times. And they said, no, the English groups aren't out, they're not happening. And look at the charts here. And the charts back then were, basically solo artists that were vocalists, but no bands. And finally, EMI said to Capitol, you're putting the record out. This group is huge. Mm-hmm. You're going to put the record out. So the record, once the Beatles record came out, and once they started getting exposure with I Want to Hold Your Hand, that was it. The doors fell down.
Yeah.
And retail on a variety of records, before even Meet the Beatles, they was introducing the Beatles on VJ and a couple of other labels, small labels that had Beatles songs, and they were selling records. And the radio people said, something's going on. We better start playing some of this music. So it evolved. Now, once I Want to Hold Your Hand exploded and went to number one, and it stayed there for a while, that was it. Once they came out with that and followed it up with She Loves You, the radio play was instant. Mm-hmm. They couldn't resist it because the public was reacting so fast. So the initial stance of going to radio was slow until that guy in Washington played him, and then it spread. After that, they became what we called in the industry an automatic. Every time there was a Beatle record, they just added it. Again, that's why Capitol Records was so crazy when the Beatles said with Rubber Soul, we're not putting out a single. They were petrified that they wouldn't get exposure.
Interesting. So my next question comes from, and I am not sure if I'm going to get his name correct, so apologies, Bill Cinque in Los Angeles, California. He wants to know who decided that they needed 2 basses on the song Think for Yourself. He said one is distorted and kind of a fuzz bass.
Yeah, there's the heavy fuzz bass, that basically plays the background riff to the song. Again, I would tell James immediately to refer to that book that I already referenced, the Complete Beatles Recordings, because you'll find the date they recorded that song. And by the way, the date for a particular song there might be 10 dates for one song, because they might have overdubbed that song, which I'm sure they did overdub on that with the basses, but they might have put the drums on another day. They might have changed the vocals on the third day. So all of the dates are referenced in that book. You can just go look at the title of the song and find out exactly when they did that in the studio and why they did that. Whether it was George Martin that suggested it, whether it was George Harrison that said, I want it, whether it was Paul, or let's try this. Mm-hmm. But it'll all be recorded in that log. I don't have the book in front of me. And if I did, I could just turn to the page and look at it, but I don't have it in front of me. It's in my library. But I would refer him immediately to that book. Any question you have about anything on any recording is in that book. That's why I say it's a Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so Steve has graciously offered his services on all things Beatles to, you can defer to him on anything. We can either pass along a question or I can get his information anytime. And you guys can have a personal one-on-one conversation, email, via text, however you like, with Steve. He's graciously offered up his time to talk about the Beatles.
I don't get tired of talking about them ever. And I really do enjoy answering people's questions. Because once you do that, they have even they're more inquisitive about their music and they want to discover even more about them. And it's their catalog it's not something that you can, the scope of their work from 1963 and all the way to the end. I'm talking about a group now, not individually. Obviously, as individuals, they went on beyond 69 and 70. But their body of work, I mean, to digest Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Abbey Road. I mean, it's an awesome amount of work that went in there. And, again, it's all withstood the greatest test of all, the test of time. But, I still am awed when I listen to that work, those works, and I hear something that I either forgot about or I haven't heard before, whether it's a bass line from Paul McCartney that I never picked up on before, or whether it's something that I didn't pick up before. And one of the things that really helped me with that was there's a tremendous group that pays incredible homage to the Beatles, and they're called the Analogs. And they have a number of videos out on YouTube. And what they do is they will go out and perform note for note every Beatles song in an entire album. Mm-hmm. They'll do the White Album, the Sgt. Pepper. And when you see them live, I watched part of the White Album the other night, and they were doing things, and I said, what? There was this in that song? I got to go back. It was in Obla Di, Obla Da. Mm-hmm. And they were playing things in that song, and I said, I got to go back and listen to it. Well, I went back to the Mark Lewison book, again, The Complete Beatles, and bingo, there it was. Wow. All the stuff that I was seeing live that this band was doing was actually on the record, but I had never really heard it that way on the record. So rediscovering their music is timeless.
That's how I met Mark Mann. I went to see him play he did a front to back of Sgt. Pepper's and I believe Abbey Road, in an all-star band. And it was incredible. It was at the Clive Davis Theater at the Graham Museum, something that you need to come out and see for yourself. It's an intimate setting.
Yeah, I got it. Yeah, I got to see that sometime.
It's an incredible show. And Mark and John Jorgensen and just a huge lineup of, Jeffrey Allen Ross, and just blow you away.
I saw Cheap Trick here in Las Vegas. It's well over a decade ago. I was invited to see them through an old industry contact, and actually the guy who was taking care of the show, the sound, was Jeff Emmerich, who engineered all the Beatles albums with George Martin. May he rest in peace. But I met Jeff. But Cheap Trick did the entire Sgt. Pepper album from start to finish, and it was an incredible event.
I do remember that.
And getting to see that was extraordinary, and getting to see Jeff Emmerich was a gift. what stories he had.
Sure. Well, I think that is all the time we have, and we're going to wrap it up because there's so many incredible stories here, and I'm just so excited to get this one on the air. But thank you so much for joining me today, Steve. And I know we're going to be talking to you again about so many other things. We got lots of other stories to touch upon, I believe.
Well, thank you, Tiff. I'm here whenever you need.
Yeah, it was great talking to you again. And thanks for chatting with everybody and talking all things Beatles. And that's going to do it for me.
We hope you enjoyed the latest installment of the Hidden History of Rock and Roll. Be sure to like us on Facebook and follow us on all the podcast platforms. Thanks for listening to the Hidden History of Rock and Roll with your host, Tiffany Scott.